All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar on the shipping crisis, container crisis, and all things kind of related to what's going on right now with trade, because it's a big topic. So so glad that everyone could join us today. We're joined. My name is Rachel Premack. I am a senior investigative reporter at Business Insider. I cover trucking, logistics, shipping, freight, all that fun stuff. And we're joined today by Michael Gordon, who is a retired FMC advisor. And we're also joined by Hariesh Manaadiar, who's the founder of the Shipping and Freight Resource. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I'm wondering if, just to get started, if both of you could kind of tell us a little bit about your backgrounds, how you got interested in the shipping and freight world, and yeah, your perspective just going on this crazy year. Yeah, just a minute or two for both of you, just to shed a little light on your backgrounds.
I go back a long way. I started getting interested in this industry back actually when I was going back to college. My parents lived in Tokyo, Japan, and I needed a ride back to San Diego, California. So I hopped one of the U.S. flag ships, did that on 3 occasions, and found myself working for a break bulk operator by the name of Waterman Lines. Spent a few years with them, went over to APL for 8 years, and continued with them until the mid-90s. I was mainly on the sales and marketing side of things. However, I did get involved in operations, especially with the break bulk operations. I joined the federal government back in 1999, first with the Maritime Administration. My main, I don't want to call it a priority, but my main project I was working on was marine highways. Found myself joining the Federal Maritime Administration on a detail, and that was back in, I want to say 2011. Loved it so much when they asked me to stay on full time. I stayed on obviously, and retired in 2000, last year, December 30th, 2020. Basically involved in a lot of different things within the maritime industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And Hariesh, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and how you got into this whole world.
Thanks, thanks, Rachel. I've been in the shipping and freight industry now for 32 years. Like many in shipping, I'm sure others would agree as well. Like many in shipping, I also fell into shipping accidentally. I don't know many people who have willingly come into this industry, and I'm one of them. And from there, there's no turning back. Loved every minute of it. I've been handling various types of vessels. Started off as an operator or documentation, handling vessel operations, stowage planning, container planning, and then slowly moved into commercial and sales activities. I'm originally from Chennai in India, but I've been working overseas for since 1994 in UAE and South Africa and Mozambique. Right now I'm based in South Africa. And yeah, and in 2008, as a passion project, I started writing about shipping and freight to educate Joe public about what it really entails and what we all do. And based on the feedback from the readers, it's been a very good 13 years so far, and I'm still continuing to write under my resource called Shipping and Freight Resource, and it's been a very good journey so far. And thank you to all my readers. I see many familiar names here on the chat list as well, so it's a good start.
Okay, great. And I guess my first question, just looking at this project44 report we have here, one of the things that really stuck out to me was that apparently only 8% of shippers have found, solutions to the shipping crisis. And it seems that the main solutions that they're taking is either sourcing materials closer to home or, just preferring those less congested ports. I'm wondering, is that a solution that everyone can take? And if so, why have only 8% have looked into that?
I think the main reason for this is, or the biggest reason I would say, is Nobody expected it. Nobody expected what is happening. The sudden onset of the pandemic and the scale at which it spread, the speed at which it spread right through, it was unprecedented. Because before the pandemic became a pandemic, many people expected it to be something like the previous SARS or MERS viruses that were circulating in the in the Far East, Southeast Asia regions, and that those viruses didn't affect the global industries like this COVID has impacted. And quite honestly, nobody expected this, or the spread, as I mentioned. So in my view, people and businesses didn't have time to react, and also because it was entirely new to many people, including carriers. A lot of the carriers had to withdraw capacity because the ports were shut down, businesses were shut down, entire countries were shut down. So there's no point in the shippers running, or the shipping lines running services to countries which are closed, or the ports which are closed. So everything was up in the air, everything was in turmoil, and as I said, it was all of a sudden. So the shipping lines obviously had to withdraw capacity, and they had to also stop orders for ships which they had planned, because it's not a quick build. So they had a planned order book which they had to stop or cancel because of this. And the second thing nobody predicted was the boom or the demand in goods that followed the recovery from pandemic. Once China opened and other countries started opening, people were not ready or prepared for this boom, and even the American experts were taken by surprise at the sudden demand from these consumers. And I'm sure Michael can add a few points to that as well.
Um, Definitely. It's very safe to say that especially the U.S. ports weren't aware of what the ramifications of COVID would be. That being said, there were signs of congestion building up before the pandemic. In fact, some might say that the seeds to some of the congestion we're facing today was launched back when Maersk Lines brought out the Triple E ships, which we all know were in the mid 15,000, I believe we're in the mid 15,000 TEU range. You had Maersk order those ships, and of course what happened was the other carriers following suit had to go out and order their ships of equal size, and that's when the snowball chain started taking effect. And what you had was these ships were really too big for many of the ports here in the United States to handle. You had ports like LA Long Beach that were in a little better position to take on these vessels, but as more and more of them called the different ports in the United States, you had the congestion start building up. You also, in response, had ports trying to accommodate the ships, and they started trying to, build up infrastructure to handle these ships, and they've never really been able to catch up. And so you have, the introduction of additional volume. You had the introduction of shipments, imports into this country happening so much quicker than anyone anticipated. You had the agricultural shipments that developed. And so you had this concentration of containers at these ports that just merged all at once, and it was sort of an antiquated situation that they had to accept. And its velocity, the throughput of the ports could not keep up with the demand of what the shippers requesting, and also the carriers. It just could not be handled, and as a result, you had this congestion that we are witnessing even today, and we do not really know when it's going to end. You have a lot of the people that run the ports, like Gene Soroka, who think it's going to be over by the end of the year. but I'm not so sure that's going to happen because even now, you're having to anticipate the Christmas rush coming up, and following that, before that clears out, you're going to have, the Valentine Day rush. I mean, it just seems to be a continuous thing. You have the Easter rush after that. So the big question is, are ports going to be able to clear out the containers that are already on their site and keep this buildup that's just going to continue to get larger and larger and larger, and yet the infrastructure is just not there at this point to adequately address these surges.
What are some of those less congested ports that people are able to find, whether they're in the US or elsewhere? I'm curious what those ports are that are apparently not as congested as, LA Long Beach or what have you.
Well, what's happening is you have some of the Canadian ports on the West Coast, and they're even talking about, developing some of the ports, Canadian East, on the East Coast, Canadian ports, and trying to rail that down. You hear about Kansas City Southern, was just bought out. The last time I heard, there were two Canadian railways were sort of duking it out. But the big thing about Kansas City Southern is they have rail links between some of the West Coast Mexican ports, which are, some of them are highly efficient, where they're going to be able to take containers and rail them right up through the middle, the heartland of the country. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that develops, because both Canada and Mexico are investing heavily in those ports to accommodate the flow of containers that just can't get into the United States right now. And before this COVID situation, it was interesting because there was a lot of concern up by the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, of course, and LA Long Beach, maybe to a little lesser extent, but they were still very concerned about the imports siphoning off from the traditional port of entry in the United States to those Canadian Mexican ports. Probably, if you look at it now, maybe it's a good thing they did have those relief valves there in Canada and Mexico, because the congestion might even be worse. I know also too that you had the widening of the canal, which definitely did help. And you have a sort of, I don't want to call it a resurgence, but certainly the ports in the US that are located in the Gulf and also the East Coast are sort of engaged in a little bit of a renaissance, where they're seeing their imports pick up, and it looks like it's going to be here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. In fact, I read this morning where I think it was the month of June, the port of New York, New Jersey overtook Long Beach as the second most active port. I mean, that's just for that particular month. No one's saying that New York, New Jersey is going to replace Long Beach as the second largest port, but it is interesting to note that you're starting to see these different cargo flows to avoid the congestion.
Just to add there, Rachel, it's also, as Michael also mentioned, it's not just easy as well to find alternate solutions because of the size of these vessels. Not all the ports in the US or anywhere around the world are able to handle the vessels of these size vessels. So you can't just skip a port and go to the next port just because of congestion. So they are in many ways stuck for solutions because of that, precisely because of that, because not just that the port has to handle or be able to handle those vessels in terms of draft, but they should be able to handle in terms of equipment, in terms of onshore labor, in terms of yard space. There are many factors involved, because these ships, some of them are at the moment 24,000 TEUs, and almost all of them are full. So it's a big issue which the ports have to face. But the key driver for this is the unprecedented consumer demand in US, which has spiked everything and has caused pretty much the issues that we are seeing right now.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess kind of the big question right now is, do you see this massive buildup of containers and massive congestion of shipping vessels at, Long Beach, LA, and other sort of major ports. Um, and it does look like the congestion is abating slightly, but we're obviously still seeing major delays. We're still seeing shortages. Most predictions say that things will get back to normal, maybe in early 2022. Um, what's going on with this congestion right now, and when will it? When in your both of your opinions, when will the congestion ease up a little bit?
See, in terms of the congestion in ports on the east, for example, if you take Yantian was one of the recent examples where there's a massive buildup of containers, and that was mainly because of the COVID situation, which there was a resurgence there. And but that has come down. Many shipping lines had to cancel calls. They had to blank sailings, and some of them were waiting there for a very long time till they could get their till they could get the port in order. And as a result of that, there were spillovers from Yantian into Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and other Nansha and other ports around that area. So there are many factors contributing to these congestions, not just one. Yes, demand is one and one of the main drivers. But when one port gets better with COVID, then the other one seems to start. Crew change is an issue, and seafarers are really tired. Some of them have been working on ships for a year without a break, and all those leads to productivity issues and many other factors. But yes, Yantian has come back. The lines have started calling the port again. But if you look at the ports in China itself, there's in the top 10 container ports in China, I think seven are top 10 around the world. Seven are in China, if I'm not mistaken. And that could happen anytime, anywhere in China, which will obviously impact on the rest of the world and the movements because everybody is dependent on China at this stage. Um, LA and Long Beach, as Michael mentioned, it's also getting better, but we are not yet out of the woods. So this could continue for a good couple of months, and that is why, because initially when the rates started going up in September last year or August last year, and the container shortages came into play, the capacity issues came into play. People assumed, okay, after the Chinese New Year, things will calm down. Chinese New Year has come and gone, still nothing. And then and also one of the main issues seems to be that the containers are stuck in the wrong places. It's not in the same demand surplus cycle. So it is moving. A lot of the containers are moving also into surplus areas. And now, for example, ports in Vietnam are being backed up. So that could also cause further congestion down both upstream and downstream. And it's a vicious cycle. It just keeps going around and around at this stage. And I don't think anybody has a clear answer on when these issues will abate. But maybe Michael can add a bit more on US ports if there is any light at the end of the tunnel.
Um, it's sort of interesting in our discussion so far. Most of it's taken place within this being a short-term event, and what we're talking about right now is, the present. As we move forward, what are the U.S. ports going to do to try to stay ahead of this question with about congestion? It was just mentioned about the displacement of some of the containers today where they're not really needed and they need to be moved to areas where they are needed. And I was reading an article this morning about the June totals for, again, it was Long Beach and Los Angeles. And just out of the port of Long Beach, you had 250,000 empty containers move on out of the port. And these were empty, meaning they were carrying no revenue at all. Port of Los Angeles was 312,000 containers moving out of the port through the month of June. That was again, no revenue. And by the way, this also leads to why some of the carriers, in order to make up for the revenue shortfall, or you're having these, some say, excessive rates coming into the United States on the import side. But like I say, I don't see any real relief of this congestion. This is a long-term challenge to the ports, I think. And I think one of the things that has to be done realistically is the U.S. ports are going to have to sit down with their rail and truck counterparts to see how, it's not a question just of throughput at the port, it's also the velocity of that throughput at the port. And so you can have the throughput and all that, but if you have no way to move the stuff out at, at some sort of velocity that exceeds the equipment going into the port, you're going to be stuck with the situation where you're going to have this massive buildup and sort of a clog, if you want to call it, of containers. And so the question is, how do the ports look at the surrounding areas where they may be able to buy their way out? The port of LA Long Beach, I think, can still, through landfill, I should say, increase their footprint and handle additional shipments. But also, too, when you look at that, you have to say, okay, how are you going to have truck access? How are you going to have rail access, or at least increase the truck access? How are you going to increase the rail access to address this congestion issue?
Right. And going off of what Hariesh just mentioned, and what you also just mentioned, Michael, is this idea of containers finally going back to Asia for reloading, which is kind of, seems like it's one of the big underpinning factors around our container shortage, which is really more of a containers in the wrong area kind of issue. Now that we are seeing, containers actively being made and containers going back to where they need to go, when do you see the quote container shortage, lessening, if at all?
That's a tough question. It's a very speculative question. Harish, do you have any ideas on that? Like I say, it's speculative. They are building.
It is very much so. But to me, it is more. It's not a case of only container shortage, but a case of increased demand for those empty containers, because all this happened only since last year, since August last year. I mean, nothing has changed. Nothing much has grown so much, and the only other than consumer demand. So a container is an asset like any asset. It has to be moving. If it is not moving, it's not generating revenue. If it is sitting somewhere quietly, so naturally for shipping lines, they want to move containers to and from where they can make revenue, and that is what they're trying to do. But because of this demand, now they're forced to place orders for new containers. For example, like MSC is placed around 850,000 container orders, but it's not going to happen immediately. They still have to manufacture. All the Chinese, 90% of the containers around the world are manufactured in China again, and all these container manufacturing yards are full up. They're all busy. Wanhai is a big intra-Asia operator in the region, Far East Southeast Asia region, and they have placed orders to replenish or add on 62.9% of their existing fleet. So that's a massive number to replenish. So you can imagine if you have 100 containers, you have placed another 62.9 containers more to place orders for to meet this demand. So, and it's not always easy to route containers only in one direction, because you have to, if a vessel is sailing across or Trans-Pacific or Trans-Atlantic, wherever, and if it is calling 11 ports, for example, along the route, you have to cater for containers for those 11 ports. And you may not find return cargo from all 11 ports at the pace that you wanted, at the speed that the liners wanted. So there is always going to be this mismatch between supply and demand. And the lines are really trying their best to manage it as best as they can, because customers are customers, and we are also end users or end consumers, and we always want things now. And then it is up to the shipping lines to make it happen. So it's the container shortage is not going to go down immediately, but to alleviate that, the shipping lines have placed orders. Many of the shipping lines have placed different orders based on their requirement. And as I said, the highest is so far that we have seen is 62.9% in terms of percentage, and in terms of numbers, it is 850,000 that MSC has placed an order for containers. Other than container ships, that is another story altogether.
Okay, and speaking of containers, we have one question from the audience mentioning the use of foldable containers. And this audience member mentioned that there's no widespread interest at this time. I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if any of you have heard of foldable containers or have any kind of experience with that, but I'd love to hear your perspectives if you do have a
yeah, foldable containers have been around in the market for a very long time. It's both folding vertically and folding horizontally. Yes, it can help alleviate space issues or congestion issues in certain ports and certain places. But again, it's a question of cost, it's a question of utilization, and it's a question of what type of cargoes these containers are capable of carrying. The payload of the container, that is very important. Can it contain? Can it carry all sorts of all types of cargoes? So there's many factors involved in that. But most importantly, it's the cost of all this, and also I'm sure people know, but to those who are not aware, not all shipping companies or shipping lines own their own containers. They lease quite a bit of the containers as well. Like they do ships, they charter ships, they also lease containers. And they lease at will from many big leasing companies. And leasing companies buy containers from manufacturers or place orders. So there are many players in this market already handling that. And I stand to be corrected, but there are certain cases where I don't think these has been certified yet by ISO, these foldable containers. ISO is the International Standards Organization. So all these containers that we are seeing moving across the oceans are certified and are standardized by ISO, so that all ports around the world, all the ships around the world can accommodate those and carry those containers. Foldable containers, it's still not out of the picture completely, but there is a big interest, definitely, and there are many companies, new companies coming up with those options. But at some stage, it may be commercially viable more than it is today.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And Michael,
No, I was just going to say I really don't have anything to add as far as a foldable container go. I mean, it's a product that's been out there for some time, and for whatever reasons, it hasn't gained a wide audience. But it's not to say you don't have them out there. And what their future is right now, I think, is still being to be determined.
Right. Okay, and so moving on to this idea of, we've been talking quite a bit about trade flows, trade imbalances, and one of the big questions, Michael, that you mentioned before is just this idea that manufacturers have been really relying on just-in-time manufacturing, and all sorts of companies and retailers especially have been really interested in low inventory practices just as a way to keep costs down. But we've obviously seen in this past year or two that this practice definitely has its risks. Do you believe that there will be that more companies and retailers and manufacturers will turn away from just-in-time or turn away from low inventory ideas, or is this something that they'll deal with it now and then forget about it going forward? Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Again, a lot of this is very speculative. A lot of it depends on the particular importer or exporter's particular situation that they're in. I think a lot of the shippers that you see out there right now are sort of sitting on this fence wondering what to do, because a lot of what you hear is, hey, this is going to be over by the end of the year. But when you start looking at changing your supply chain, supply chain is very much like a pipeline. You can turn on the spigot, you can turn it off. And the question to these people is, they're looking at how much this is going to cost them. And they say, okay, if we turn this thing off too early, how is it going to affect it? Not only, our bottom line, but also to the customer. And so you have that situation where people are, like I say, just sitting on the fence. And then you have to remember the economics of the situation when, if you're supporting us sourcing out of, let's say, Shanghai, and now all of a sudden, are you going to source out of Mexico? I mean, there's a cost to that, both in economical costs, and then also too, the volatility of the area that you might start purchasing some of your supplies out of. I mean, that comes into question too. I mean, who would have expected you would have had issue getting cargo out of southern China this year? I mean, it just wasn't there. So I'm guessing as time goes by, people will be looking at their bottom line, and they will be looking at, hey, and we already touched upon it briefly, looking at alternate ports, and just that takes into effect, okay, China's a big country. I mean, do they now source out of, let's say, northern China rather than southern China? You have the same issues with that as you do if, let's say, you're going to go right next door to Mexico, or let's say Canada, to say if you're going to source out of there. So a lot of this depends on the individual shipper, unfortunately, and it's a decision that they in-house have to make. There's not any grand answer. It's a very personal issue with each shipper that's going to be out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting looking at what was going on in 2019, at least in the US, when more companies were looking to source, out of Vietnam or out of Central America or Mexico, kind of switching their sourcing from China to other sort of countries. So, I mean, it is in some way a positive that US companies are already thinking, okay, where else can we source? How else can we diversify? Right. And then this happened. Right. But obviously we weren't fully prepared.
Yeah. The other question you brought up was about the, I just saw it, I think it was Maersk Lines that first brought it up about just in case movements versus the pipe, the old, I guess, the Japanese were first to bring it up with the just-in-time type shipments, and the way that there's some consideration being given, does it make more sense to have a just-in-case type supply line versus a just-in-time supply line? And again, it's a question of economics, because one of the beauties of just-in-time was you didn't have to have warehouses really in the United States, or at least minimal size warehouses, versus these huge warehousing spaces that U.S. companies had prior to adopting the just-in-time shipments. So now that the carriers are saying, in some cases, maybe it might make more sense to go into this quote-unquote just in case, which would mean you'd keep more supplies here in the United States. In other words, you'd have more coming through your pipeline there and supplying larger warehouses, so that you wouldn't be so much affected by these congestion issues. And again, it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because so much of it depends on, hey, what's the cost to the bottom line?
Absolutely correct. And my view, just in time is not going anywhere. It is just going to be there's going to be supplemented with a few other things, and it's already happening. Michael mentioned just in case. There's also another thing called just in sequence, because there's no point in just in time getting 10 right doors when you need a left door as well for an automotive lineup, automotive assembly line. So those kind of things that there's many such factors that are involved in such shipments. And yes, people, the just-in-time will not go away, but people have seen what can happen with the dependence on just-in-time, and definitely will look for alternatives. The alternatives could involve sourcing goods closer to home. Maybe that's stuff that can be brought in by trucks or rail or any other alternative modes of transport, and not depending on sea freight completely. But of course, that will be at a cost, which eventually may fall on the consumer, which is you and I, for those extra bucks that they need to pay, um, or to source it from a place other than their traditional markets. So those kind of things will be definitely influencing in the months to come, and I'm sure we will see that as well.
All right, all right. And one last question before we move on to some of our audience questions. Looks like many of you have submitted some great questions, so we're going to dig into that in the next few minutes. But one last kind of big question for both of you. I mean, given the idea that we're not going to be able to suddenly replace all these ports that can't hold these newly massive ships, and given that we won't be able to magically address any of these trade imbalances, it seems pretty likely that this shipping crisis could continue on for much longer, or that could, come again, emerge again in the future. What steps would you take, or what steps would you advise that that ought to be taken to prevent this, or to just make this shipping infrastructure work better?
Well, that's a really big question to answer in so little time. In fact, the question that's always been nagging me for a while now is I've always been asking myself, when is the U.S. going to retake control of its supply chain? We seem to be the only big trading nation, if you want to call it. And we don't even have a U.S. merchant marine anymore. I mean, you literally do not have any ships on the high seas flying the U.S. flag on the back end of it. You have one carrier out there that does an amazing job and does hold up that banner, is Matson out of the West Coast. They have a ship that goes out to Hawaii, out to Guam, and then it hops over to China. But that's and then they come back, and it's a great little operation if you haven't seen it. But that's one little incident, and it's a once again this is a long range solution, if you even want to call it a solution. And you do have the Biden administration out there. They're talking about infrastructure, and you have to ask yourself, okay, is this the time? And I'm sure they're already doing this. They don't need the four of us sitting here and giving them the solution, but I'm sure they're already sitting there and they're talking about it in Washington of, hey, how do we take a U.S. port that does have these constraints? They're basically all landlocked except for the water side. And I'm talking about landlocked as far as getting the cargo off the ports. I mean, how do we take some of these ports and put in 24 gates when they approach a terminal, like you see in some of the Mexican ports? How do you, get the rail to bring in extra track to get the containers off the terminal? And these are the issues you have to address going forward if you're ever really going to get out there and take a look at a port like Shanghai. I mean, we don't have anything like it in the United States. And you're going to have to look at those ports out there for some sort of at least blueprints on how we might proceed in expanding. And once again, I keep referring to the velocity. I mean, everyone knows these ports have throughput, but how do you increase that throughput? And it's only by addressing these landside issues. Why aren't we using the inland waterways? I mean, it's part of the national transportation system. Why aren't we using those waterways to supplement rail and truck traffic? And, you might say, what are you talking about? But take a look at the Bay Area in San Francisco. You have the Port of Oakland, and then you have Stockton and Sacramento up the, 90 miles away. And you just take everything in by truck when you could be putting some of this on barges. Is this the best way to do it? Maybe not, but all this all these alternatives should be looked at because somewhere out there, I mean, we have enough people that are very good at looking at logistical patterns that can help resolve this issue.
Right, definitely. Yeah, the merchant marine question is something that I wrote about a few weeks ago. Just I don't think a lot of people are aware that we just don't have one anymore.
We blew it away.
And it is bizarre. Yeah,
We just blew it away.
It's bizarre, and it's just not.
You are not the only country, Michael, but yes, as you mentioned, you're one of the largest. I mean, you are the largest economy in the world, and for that size and for that level of business, yes, that should be there.
I might add, it's understandable what led to the demise of the U.S. merchant marine. The main argument that's posed is it just got too expensive to operate ships with the U.S. flag on the back end. It got too expensive to try to build these ships here in the United States. But it would seem to me that someone somewhere should be looking at a piece of paper and start writing down notes. I mean, we're talking about $20,000 a container coming into the Long Beach between Shanghai and LA. Can you, you'd have to rewrite the rules. You have to rewrite the regs because it's very specific what it takes to, have the U.S. flag on the back end of a ship. But you could rewrite the rules and regulations to what I call meet today's realities. It's something at least maybe should be looked at. It might be pie in the sky. You probably break a lot of rice bowls because there are many reasons why the U.S. merchant marine went out of business, and far too many. And it's a very complex discussion to bring on the tail end of this webinar. But I often shake my head, and it drives me nuts because I remember when I was a kid and I was in Yokohama, and I'd look out at the at the ships out there, and you had half dozen U.S. flag operators calling the port of Yokohama, and now it's you don't see any of them. They're all gone. They're relics of the past, if you want to call it.
Yeah. Right. And I imagine most of them are serving Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. It's not.
That's
right.
That's completely different. That's where you get into, as you know, Rachel, the Jones Act versus if you want to call it the Blue Water Fleet. But if you ever wanted to look at getting back, bringing back the U.S. merchant marines, it's those carriers. It's the Matsons of the world. It's it escapes me right now, and shame on me because I know I'm going to get in trouble for this. But the operator that goes up to the RORA operation up out at Tote, the people at Tote, these are the people that you have to talk to. Salt Chuck, that operates Tote and various other carriers. These are the brains that we have out there that could possibly, if there's ever a chance to resurrect the U.S. Marine. But like I say, you have to change the rules and regulations so that they address today's reality. And I don't think we've done that. I really don't. But
right.
That's
right.
me.
Yeah, definitely. And Hariesh, what are your thoughts on steps that could be taken? Obviously, we're just three people chatting on a webinar, but I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I agree with what Michael mentioned quite a bit elaborately as well, and some of the things is to improve the rail network within. If you're talking only U.S. Rail network within the U.S. also, because yesterday also there was some embargo happening, and there's fears of a strike looming, and that could affect the congestion even further. But speaking about crisis, don't also another shipping crisis. Don't also forget that the next shipping crisis could be the continuance of containers falling off the ships because there's quite a lot of that has happened in the last year. One ship alone had around 1,900 containers that fell off, and there's a widespread concern that it is because of these big ships. The stability and the stowage has not been really tested under full circumstances because it's impossible to test it with so many containers. So that could be the next thing that is coming up, and obviously the preparedness of the ports around the world to be able to handle these huge vessels that are under order and still to come.
Definitely, definitely. Well, thank you both for going over those questions, going over the report, and let's turn to some of these audience questions. We've got quite a few to look through. One of the kind of the big questions in that mentioned, a few people have mentioned this Q&A, is that and this is maybe a little bit of a controversial question, but the idea that we see there's sort of this question right now that the large carriers are hiking up prices, increasing prices, and most of them are consolidated. There's a few giants out there, and it seems that they might even be matching prices, that they're kind of colluding with each other to increase prices more and more. What are your thoughts on that? It's a controversial question, but I think it's something that I have seen quite a bit discussed, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and now in this Q&A. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
It's a legitimate question. This question was going on actually before the COVID thing, with reduced sailings or ghost sailings, shipments that weren't accepted because allegedly the ship was full, that type of thing. So, I mean, one can easily see where this question is circling in many different parties. But again, this is where you have to look at your regulatory agencies, and when you look at them, it's something you and I can't do, but they have to take a hard look at what they're doing. One of these, it's not to mention names, is the Federal Maritime Commission. There was recently a presidential executive order where they were named specifically to look at ways to look into this demurrage situation, a detention situation. And I think it again gets down to the point, do the rules that are there in the shipping acts, do they adequately address what's going on in industry today? I mean, are the realities there that these rules properly address some of these concerns that shippers have? And then you have to say, does the Federal Maritime Commission have the authority to look into some of these allegations? I believe they teamed up with the Department of Justice recently, so maybe the two of them working together can at least investigate some of these allegations. We'll have to see what happens. Time will tell.
What would you say are the causes of these blank sailings that we're seeing more and more? That's one of the big questions that we're seeing in this webinar.
Well, it's interesting. Again, you have to be very careful the way you answer some of these questions you're posing because of the controversy they create. But you take a look at, I think the carriers I don't want to say they brought it upon themselves, but you take a look at the way they operate. You have the alliances. Now, the carriers are not, they're not supposed to, not allowed to talk about rates between themselves. But you have, these alliances headquartered, in Singapore. You have them headquartered, I want to say one of them's in London. And what they're doing in these headquarters are they respond to in other words, the schedules and the responses to shippers' needs are handled in these offices. There's basic allocations on these vessels of the partners. And again, the perception that some of these allegations that you brought up among, let's call it canaries out there, the perception, I can see where some of this stuff comes up. And until the carriers many of them, were created by themselves. Until the carriers can address these things in a clear and consistent manner, you're always going to have people thinking, hey, there's collusion, and it might be false news, it might not be, but until there's transparency in how these alliances fully operate, if there's not enough now, maybe there should be more, and you might be able to get down to some of these concerns and get rock solid, hard answers. I know I've been beating around the bush here a little bit, but
no,
like
I think that makes sense. Like,
it's a very controversial subject, and I know the regulatory agencies, they do, they look at this stuff, and again, with the rules of what they have in hand now, if you want to call it, you have to ask yourself, and they have to ask themselves, hey, are these rules facing the realities we're operating under today? And if they aren't, then they've got to change it.
Right. Yeah, I think just more transparency is, and you see that, or I've seen that covering the trucking industry as well, which is more of what I know a little bit better in the logistics world, is that there isn't a whole lot of communication between these fleets and these companies and the public, and that can be done, working better with journalists like myself, or just having more interaction, more communication with consumers. And I think we've covered this a few times, but a few audience members are asking, I guess, straight up, when is this going to be over? When are these prices going to go down? And that's obviously a big question, a lot of uncertainty. My understanding is hopefully beginning of 2022. That's my very short answer, but I'm not sure.
The answer to that lies at this moment, the answer to that lies in the American consumer. It's the American consumer that is driving this demand. And obviously, initially people said, or they still do, it is because of COVID, it is because of the shutdown of COVID. Now, there are various different explanations. First, starting with the shutdown of COVID, then the inability or inactivity during COVID lockdowns. So they had to do something. So they bought stuff because ports and shipping were working. The rest of the local stuff was closed. Local shops were closed. Local businesses were closed. So they had to go online. They had to go online and buy things. So that continued. And probably when they found the convenience of it all, ordering something today and getting it a week later, or the next day even, or the same day even in some cases. So people started buying more and more and more, and that is obvious from various reports that are there. So it's a bit of a tough one, because when does a American consumer stop buying? There's no timeline to that, or there's no specific answer to that. So the shipping is just shipping, you must know, is a derived demand. It's not something that people need or people want, but it is there. It's a derived demand, and they need it in order to get what they want. So they don't need shipping per se, but they need what shipping brings in to their homes. So once they stop buying, maybe then the shipping demand will reduce. But from a shipping perspective, I hope not. But yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've been writing in my articles, is just stop buying stuff and things will go back to normal.
Yeah,
but we'll see.
If you think of it too, you have to get a little nervous that we might just have a repeat of last year, in that I was looking at the news again this morning, and a lot of red out there when you take a look at North America.
Yeah.
It's very, very scary. It's very scary, and we have to see how this plays out.
Yeah. And we've been talking a lot about, the US specifically, I guess, as 2/3 of the panel are based actually in the East Coast. But I've got a few questions from one listener from Kenya, one person from the Dominican Republic, just asking a little bit more about how these how all of this has affected how all of this has affected smaller countries, or countries in Africa or South America. The listener from Dominican Republic actually mentioned that he's seeing shipments being rolled over and over. Kind of has this perspective that carriers are giving priority to the US, Canada, Mexico, just these, larger countries. Is that something that either of you have been seeing, or I guess how has this crisis been affecting
Yes, definitely, because
countries
your
outside of-
trans-Pacific and transatlantic are the biggest trade routes. And even on the Europe trade route, European customers are also facing this issue more because the rates to US are skyrocketing, obviously, and because of the demand. And so the rates to the other countries are also skyrocketing. Because the majority of the shipping lines, obviously, that's the most traded route, the Trans-Pacific. And as more and more ships, as more and more containers go into that route, and that route is already very lucrative for the carriers, they may not have enough capacity to service the other routes. So naturally, this is going to affect certain trade routes, but it has not all. It's not affected everybody similarly or in the same way. It has affected each geographical location differently. Africa has been affected differently. At least here, the freight rates have not gone up to that levels that you see in US and Europe. And each area, as I said, is affected differently. Then there is a completely different set of operators, for example, who operate only within the intra-Asia area. They don't step out of that area to come to Trans-Pacific or the transatlantic routes. So they are happy and content servicing those areas, but still the equipment is still an issue. So because the ships that service those areas are much smaller than the Trans-Pacific and transatlantic, so they are able to service those routes. But of course, the big thing is the container shortage, which has affected every trade route. I hope that answers your question for the reader.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, we've got just a few minutes before we are all wrapped up for the day. I guess Michael and Hariesh, thank you again for taking the time to join and share your expertise. Is there any sort of takeaways that you'd love our attendees to go about the rest of their day with, or keep in mind as they conduct business in this crazy industry that we're all in?
In other words, maybe we'll have patience. This too will. This also will pass. But all seriousness, unfortunately, a lot of this is just playing the waiting game right now. We can take everything we know and we can try to draw conclusions, but we've never gone through something this massive or this size before, and you can only control it so much with the tools you have, which the ports are trying to do. And then when following this, you do your lessons learned, and you go from there to try to address the lessons that the ports are going to learn for sure, and what the shippers are going to learn.
Definitely.
I think Michael covered what I was about to say, but yes, as he said, this too will pass, and obviously it's the belief that everybody is trying their best because everybody wants a piece of the pie. The carriers, the ports, the consumers, the trucker, the clearinghouse agents, the freight forwarders. Everybody wants a part of this feeding frenzy, so to speak. So everybody is trying to get it all to work, and I don't think anybody is willingly trying to sabotage anything here. But I think it's purely a question of supply and demand. And all of a sudden, at this moment, demand is too much. And somebody asked a question: what happens to all these containers when things go back to normal? Well, then the freight rates start to drop, and then the capacity. It's a cycle. It just continues. That is my ending statement for this webinar. Thank you, Rachel, for an enlightening discussion, and also Michael for many of the points that you mentioned. Thanks again.
I enjoyed participating. Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
You too.
You too.
Take
care.
care.
Bye.
Stay safe.